What if the United States is no longer writing its own Middle East strategy? What if, in the Iran war, Washington is just executing a script written in Jerusalem and not at the White House? And if that is true, who really benefits from this crisis? Israel and the Gulf, or outsiders like Turkey, Russia, or China? In this war, the US looks like it has fallen prey to Israel's most aggressive regional agenda. Formally, it is the senior partner, but it behaves more like a junior one reacting to Israeli priorities instead of setting its own. Instead of restraining escalation, it has backed maximalist goals against Iran that serve Israel first and US interests only second. American diplomacy, military power, and credibility are being spent on a campaign whose logic is written in Jerusalem, not in Washington. This is clear in how Washington followed Israeli pressure for massive strikes and a decapitation strategy against Iran. Rather than saying this crosses our red lines and destabilizes the region, it accepted the framing of Iran as an immediate existential threat and joined the war. Inside Washington, this comes with a major internal shift. Donald Trump, who once presented himself as anti-war and anti-neocon, now acts like a neoconservative president. Surrounded by hawks and influenced by figures like Marco Rubio, he embraces using American power offensively to reshape hostile regimes. Rubio's rise over someone like J.D. Vance is symbolic. Vance stood for stay out of endless wars, while Rubio represents proactive intervention and regime pressure. This is how the US is again stuck in a Gulf War with even worse prospects of success. Iran is large, battle-hardened, skilled in asymmetric warfare, and backed by a network of allies and proxies. Instead of being intimidated, it has been emboldened. The strikes confirm what hardliners in Revolutionary Guard have long claimed, that the US and Israel seek regime change, not just behavior change. Inside Iran, the war brings not moderation, but consolidation. Hardliners argue that compromise was naive and only maximal resistance works. By hitting US bases, Gulf infrastructure, and Israel itself, Iran shows it cannot be easily broken. The longer this goes on, the more it looks like another indecisive conflict draining US resources without a clear political victory. At the same time, the Gulf monarchies are facing an uncomfortable truth. For years, they sold themselves as islands of security, safe for investment, tourism, and global finance. US bases and security ties were marketed as guarantees of protection. Now that image is reversing, and those bases look more like magnets for missiles and drones. Having a US base no longer means we are safer than our neighbors, it means we are in the front row of the target list. For Gulf elites, this shatters the aura of untouchability. For citizens and investors, it raises a simple question. In the next regional war, will Dubai, Doha, or Abu Dhabi really be spared, or are they now part of the battlefield? If we zoom out, we can ask, who are the global winners of this new war? One counterintuitive answer is Turkey. With Iran weakened and under heavy pressure, Israel has removed or distracted one of its main Muslim competitors. By doing so, it has opened a window for Ankara. Turkey is now the only Muslim power that combines a sizable military, NATO membership, regional ambitions, and leadership willing to openly confront Israel if needed. Turkish forces and influence already sit close to Israel in northern Syria, in the eastern Mediterranean, and now even in Gaza, where Ankara has entered as a kind of guarantor after the truce. This puts Turkey and Israel on a slow-motion collision course. The more Turkey presents itself as the only serious Muslim actor able to limit Israel, the more soft power it gains in the Arab and wider Islamic world. And the more Israeli military dominance will run into Turkish red lines. Israel may have weakened Iran, but it has helped elevate Turkey as the central counterweight. A clear short-term winner is Russia. Higher oil prices quickly mean higher revenues for Moscow, giving it more cash for the war in Ukraine and its domestic networks, especially if some oil-related sanctions are quietly relaxed under the excuse that the world needs Russian barrels. Beyond economics, the war lets Russia pose as a crisis manager, talking to Iran, Israel, the Gulf, and the West at the same time. It also dilutes the moral stigma of its invasion of Ukraine. When US forces use the same tactics in places like Venezuela and Iran without broad international backing, it becomes harder for Washington and Europe to claim the moral high ground. As critics say, if everyone breaks the rules, no one is really a policeman anymore. But the biggest winner strategically and long-term is probably China. First, there is the simple military and operational dimension. With the US entangled in the Gulf, with carriers, air assets, and political bandwidth tied up in Iran and in enforcing sanctions and embargoes elsewhere like Venezuela, Washington has less flexibility to respond quickly and decisively in East Asia. If you are sitting in Beijing and planning for contingencies or invasion around Taiwan or the South China Sea, this matters. It doesn't automatically mean that China will invade Taiwan tomorrow, but it does mean that the deterrent picture has changed. US resources, both material and political, are finite. The more of them are consumed in the Middle East or Latin America, less is available for the Indo-Pacific. Second, and more importantly, Beijing is playing a longer, smarter game. Chinese leaders can see that the US is in a deep internal crisis. Polarized politics, contested elections, and a foreign policy that often swings between withdrawal and overreaction. The new aggressiveness abroad looks from Beijing like a projection of internal weakness. China does not need to rush into a big war or a dramatic move. It can simply behave as a relatively stabilizing actor, call for de-escalation, promote trade and infrastructure, and watch as the US spends its credibility in one confrontation after another. Over time, this posture quietly shifts soft power balance. When smaller and medium-sized countries see the US acting more and more like a rock state, sanctioning one day, striking the next, changing course with every election, while China presents itself as predictable, pragmatic, and focused on economic development, well, their perception of who is reliable starts to change. The more Washington acts in a transactional, short-term manner, the more Beijing can say, we are here for the long term. We build, we don't bump. There is also a very concrete geoeconomic dimension. The India-Middle East-Europe corridor was promoted as a rival to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but it relies on a chain of states that now look fragile: the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel. The more the Gulf becomes a theater of war and sabotage, the less credible this corridor becomes as a stable long-term route. That, in turn, improves the relative position of Chinese-backed land and sea corridors across Eurasia and the Indian Ocean. So, the war in the Gulf is not only about missiles, it is also about whose maps investors and planners will take seriously in 10 or 20 years. All of this plays to China's civilizational patience. Beijing likes to present itself as a 5,000-year-old civilization dealing with a 250-year-old American Republic. It can afford to simply wait. It can afford to let the US burn energy and legitimacy in a series of avoidable conflicts, while China focuses on technology, trade, and slow but steady diplomatic gain. Here, a famous line from Sun Tzu's The Art of War is very relevant. To win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting, it is.